2:11 a.m. Iraq Standard Time. Al-Asad Air Base sits on a plateau above the Euphrates River bend in Anbar Province, 150 kilometers west of Baghdad. The same base that had absorbed an Iranian ballistic missile salvo in January 2020, the night the IRGC had fired its first deliberate strikes against U.S. forces after the elimination of its Quds Force commander. That strike had been telegraphed through diplomatic channels. The rockets that had impacted in 2020 had been calibrated to demonstrate capability and signal political resolve without the precision required to produce mass personnel losses in the hardened positions U.S. forces occupied. The IRGC's planning staff had called it a calibrated strike. U.S. forces had called it a warning. This was not a warning. At 2:11 a.m., 4 Iranian-backed militia groups operating from pre-surveyed positions in Anbar Province, the Salah ad-Din Corridor, and eastern Syria's Deir ez-Zor Governorate activated a coordinated fires plan that had been 14 months in preparation. The coordination across 3 geographically separated groups of fighters, operating in 2 countries under 4 separate militia command structures, had been achieved through a shared operational planning framework supplied and overseen by the IRGC Quds Forces Iraq-Syria Command. The planning framework had established firing positions, target assignments, time on target windows, and abort criteria. At 2:11 a.m., every element activated within a 31-second window. From Anbar Province, 63 107mm and 122mm rockets launched from truck-mounted rails and ground-laid systems in a pattern designed to saturate the CRAM, counter-rocket, artillery, mortar, system at Al-Asad, with more simultaneous tracks than its engagement rate could address. The IRGC's planning staff had studied Al-Asad's CRAM deployment pattern through observation of the system's test firing sequences that militia spotters had documented over 11 months. Their assessment: the Al-Asad CRAM could engage 14 tracks simultaneously at its maximum processing rate. They sent 63. From the Salah ad-Din Corridor, 14 Shahid 101 small loitering munitions lifted from launch positions concealed inside civilian agricultural structures, each carrying a 6-kilogram shaped charge warhead, flying on pre-programmed GPS waypoints toward the troop billeting and operations complex at the eastern end of the Al-Asad perimeter. The Shahed 101 was slower and smaller than the Shahed 136. It flew at 130 kilometers per hour. Its radar cross-section was smaller than a large bird, and its acoustic signature at cruise altitude was described by those who had observed it in previous operations as resembling a small motorcycle engine at distance. At 130 kilometers per hour on a GPS waypoint, it did not require any communication after launch. It could not be jammed into a course deviation. From Deir ez-Zor, 9 Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missiles launched simultaneously at the U.S. base at Mission Support Site Conoco, the former oil facility in eastern Syria that had become a U.S. forward position and the most isolated American military installation in the region. Conoco sat at the intersection of 3 militia-controlled corridors. Its garrison was 63 personnel, a figure that was the minimum consistent with maintaining the base's operational function and the maximum that the base's supply logistics and hardened shelter capacity could sustainably support in an elevated threat environment. Every person at Conoco had been rotated through a threat briefing upon arrival that was more direct than briefings at larger, better protected installations. The base commander had not softened the briefing for morale purposes. He had assessed that personnel who understood exactly what the base was and where it sat and why it mattered made better operational decisions than personnel who were managing information gaps about their own situation. The 12 months of preparation of hardened positions had been conducted under that philosophy. The positions were ready. The 63 personnel were in them. Its isolation was its operational vulnerability and its strategic purpose simultaneously. Its presence at that location constrained Iranian-backed movement along the Euphrates corridor in a way that no amount of air power operating from a more distant base could replicate. Total simultaneous strike: 63 rockets at Al-Asad, 14 Shahed 101 loitering munitions at Al-Asad billeting complex, 9 Fateh 110 ballistic missiles at Conoco, 86 weapons across 2 countries and 2 bases in a 31-second activation window. The activation had not been invisible. It had been insufficiently actionable. The U.S. intelligence community had been tracking elevated IRGC Quds Force communication activity in the Iraq-Syria theater for 8 days. The communication pattern was consistent with operational coordination rather than routine administrative traffic. Shorter message durations, more frequent exchanges between previously inactive nodes, the activation of backup communication channels that were typically used only when primary channels were assessed as compromised. The assessment had been elevated to Priority 1 warning status 3 days earlier, with a projected attack window of 1 to 7 days. That window had not been narrowed further because the operational security the IRGC had imposed on its militia partners had prevented signals intelligence from identifying the specific targets, timing, or weapons mix. Priority 1 warning without target specificity had produced maximum alert posture at both installations without producing the preemptive strike option that would have required confirmed attack indicators. U.S. forces at Al-Asad and Conoco had been at their highest readiness state for 72 hours before 2:11 a.m. Personnel were in hardened positions. The billeting complex at Al-Asad had been vacated 3 days earlier when the threat assessment elevated. Its occupants had moved to the hardened CRAM shelters that were the standard response to a rocket threat at this level. The Shahed 101's GPS waypoints had been programmed against the billeting complex's coordinates, which were accurate. The buildings they were targeting were largely empty. The CRAM system at Al-Asad, a Phalanx CRAM unit adapted from the Naval CIWS configuration, had been at maximum readiness since the elevation 72 hours earlier. Its radar was in continuous operation. Its crew had been through 3 false alarm events in the preceding 48 hours as a result of the heightened alert causing the system to log meteorological and wildlife contacts as probable threat initiations. 3 false alarms in 48 hours degraded nothing about the system's capability. They were part of the operational environment. At 2:11 a.m., the CRAM radar began tracking 63 simultaneous ballistic and semi-ballistic tracks, entering its coverage from 3 separate bearings. The tracks were not false alarms. The engagement sequence activated automatically. The CRAM engaged at maximum rate. The Phalanx's 20mm M168 cannon cycling at 4,500 rounds per minute, each burst calculated to place a lethal fragment density in the target's projected path rather than requiring a direct hit. Against a 107mm rocket spinning on its rifled axis at 200 rotations per second, the engagement was a geometry problem solved in microseconds by a fire control computer that received radar input, calculated intercept trajectory, and directed the gun to fire a burst that would intersect the rocket's path at a point forward enough of its current position to allow for the cannon's own round flight time. The system had been doing this calculation in the Gulf, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan for 17 years. It had never been asked to do it against 63 simultaneous tracks. The prioritization algorithm worked through the queue by proximity and estimated time of impact. The furthest tracks waited while the nearest tracks were engaged. The furthest tracks closed while they waited. Against 107mm and 122mm rockets in the terminal phase, the engagement range was 500 to 1,500 meters, close by any air defense standard, but the CRAM was specifically designed for this range and this target class. The system's maximum simultaneous engagement rate was 14 tracks. 63 tracks were inbound. The engagement mathematics were not in favor of a complete interception. 14 tracks at a time, working through the salvo in priority order by threat proximity, time to impact, and trajectory hazard assessment. The CRAM neutralized 34 of the 63 rockets between 2:11 a.m. and 2:14 a.m. 29 rocket impacts across Al-Asad Air Base in a 3-minute window. The impacts distributed across the base's infrastructure in a pattern that reflected the 63 rocket salvos area coverage design. 3 impacted the primary runway surface, creating impact craters that degraded but did not close the runway. The craters were at the threshold and midpoint, not at the center, and the remaining runway length was sufficient for C-130 operations. 14 impacted in the base's central logistics and vehicle park area, damaging 7 vehicles and 2 fuel storage bladders. A fuel fire from one bladder was contained by the base fire response team within 11 minutes. 8 rockets impacted the hardened operations complex area, with 3 penetrating the earthwork berms around secondary structures whose personnel had been evacuated to the hardened main facility 72 hours earlier. 4 impacted in the base's open perimeter ground, producing no operational effects. 29 rocket impacts. The base was damaged, partially on fire in the logistics area, and operationally functional on its primary mission set within the hour. Personnel. The base had been in hardened shelter posture since 1:58 a.m., when the first distant launch signatures had been detected by the forward sensor at the western perimeter. 13 minutes from first sensor detection to 2:11 a.m. 13 minutes during which the base's 487 personnel completed their shelter movement. 11 personnel were not in hardened shelters at the moment of first impact. 9 were in vehicle positions in the logistics area conducting a scheduled fuel transfer that was deemed essential and not interruptible by the duty officer's assessment. 2 were in the open between the billeting complex and the CRAM shelter when the alert was issued. All 11 received injuries, 4 moderate, 7 minor, from blast, fragment, and concussion effects. None were fatalities. The 14 Shahed 101 loitering munitions arrived over the billeting complex between 2:14 a.m. and 2:19 a.m., 3 to 8 minutes after the rocket salvo as planned. The timing had been designed to catch response teams who had moved to assess damage from the rocket impacts. The base's standing operating procedure for a post-rocket impact response was to wait for CRAM silence before damage assessment teams moved, specifically because the IRGC had used this secondary strike timing against coalition forces in Iraq before. The procedure had been issued based on that previous pattern. The damage assessment teams waited. The CRAM was not optimized against Shahed 101 class targets. The small radar cross-section and the low acoustic signature made the detection threshold marginal. The system logged 8 of 14 Shahed 101s as probable threats and engaged 6. 5 of the 6 were neutralized by the CRAM at close range. 1 Shahed 101 passed through the engagement zone with its course disrupted by the CRAM's near-miss fire solution. The warhead functioned but detonated at an oblique angle that distributed its blast effect laterally rather than into the ground. Structural damage to the exterior of one billeting building. No personnel. The building had been vacated 72 hours earlier. 6 Shahed 101s were not engaged. All 6 impacted within the billeting complex perimeter. All 6 impacted empty or near-empty structures. The precision of their GPS guidance had directed them accurately to coordinates that no longer contained the people who had been assigned to those locations. The 14-month preparation of the targeting database had been overtaken by 72 hours of threat-driven personnel relocation. At Conoco, the 9 Fateh 110 ballistic missiles arrived between 2:12 a.m. and 2:15 a.m. The base had no organic CRAM or SHORAD capability beyond individual Stinger manpads teams positioned at the perimeter. The base's isolation and its small garrison footprint had not supported the logistics required to sustain a CRAM system. The Patriot battery at Al-Asad, 280 kilometers to the northwest, had engagement geometry against the Conoco targeted Fateh 110 tracks that place the intercept solutions at the outer edge of the PAC-3's maximum range. The geometry produced intercept probability assessments of between 40 and 55% per round at that range. 4 PAC-3 rounds were released against 3 Fateh 110 tracks from Al-Asad at 2:11 a.m. The Patriot battery had been tracking the Deir ez-Zor launch signatures since 2:11 a.m. and had engaged in parallel with the Al-Asad CRAM activation. 2 intercepts confirmed at the outer engagement boundary. 1 Fateh 110 was defeated by its own terminal guidance malfunction. The navigation system had drifted during the extended flight time and impacted 1.4 kilometers north of the Conoco perimeter in open terrain. 6 Fateh 110 rounds reached the Conoco base perimeter or its immediate surroundings. The base had 63 personnel in hardened positions that had been constructed over the preceding 8 months as the threat intelligence had elevated. All 63 were accounted for post-strike. The Fateh 110 impacts rendered non-operational the base's primary vehicle maintenance facility, disabled 2 MRAP vehicles in covered parking, and severed the main power feed to the operations center. Backup generator restored operations power within 6 minutes. The base was damaged and operationally reduced. It was not overrun. It was not evacuated. The counter-operation execute order was transmitted from CENTCOM at 2:19 a.m., 8 minutes after the first militia launch. The targeting package had been pre-built against the scenario that had now occurred. A coordinated multi-group strike from 3 geographic positions in Iraq and Syria. The target list covered the known militia staging areas in Anbar province, the agricultural structures in Salah ad-Din, governorate that imagery analysis had flagged as probable Shahed 101 launch preparation sites, and the Deir ez-Zor corridor launch positions that the Fateh 110 signatures had now confirmed. F/A-18E Super Hornets from the USS Eisenhower operating in the Red Sea, 840 kilometers from the Al-Asad area, with JASSM-ER standoff range sufficient to reach all 3 target sets, received their strike packages at 2:21 a.m. M&Q-9 Reaper UAVs that had been on continuous overwatch above the Anbar province launch positions since the threat elevation. 72 hours earlier already had confirmed coordinates for 7 of the 11 rocket launch positions, having tracked the truck-mounted rail systems through their post-launch repositioning maneuvers. The Reapers released Hellfire R-9X kinetic energy missiles against the 7 confirmed positions between 2:22 a.m. and 2:29 a.m. The Hellfire R-9X's design, a kinetic energy weapon that deployed blades rather than an explosive warhead in the terminal phase, was specifically appropriate for this environment. The launch positions in Anbar province were in populated areas where explosive warhead weapons presented collateral assessment challenges that the R-9X was designed to address. 7 vehicles confirmed non-operational by 2:31 a.m. The 4 remaining launch positions, not confirmed through Reaper observation, were assigned to JASSM-ER strikes from the FA-18E package. First impacts confirmed at 3:04 a.m. The Shahed 101 launch structures in Salah ad-Din were struck by GBU-39 small-diameter bombs from B-52H aircraft operating at altitude from Al-Asad Air Base in Qatar between 3:11 a.m. and 3:17 a.m. 6 of the 9 identified structures confirmed as non-operational. 3 required follow-on assessment. The Deir ez-Zor Fateh 110 launch positions, which the Fateh 110 launch signatures had now precisely located, received JASSM-ER impacts at 3:09 a.m. All 9 confirmed launch positions addressed. By 3:31 a.m., 80 minutes after the first militia launch, the counter-operations first cycle was complete. 26 of 29 target sets addressed. 3 pending follow-on assessment. Both Al-Asad and Conoco were operationally functional. Time from first detected launch to counter-operation first cycle complete. 80 minutes. IRGC-backed militia weapons employed. 63 rockets from Anbar province at Al-Asad. 14 Shahed 101 loitering munitions from Salah ad-Din at Al-Asad billeting complex. 9 Fateh 110 from Deir ez-Zor at Conoco. Total 86 weapons across 2 countries. Al-Asad defensive results. CRAM neutralized 34 of 63 rockets. 6 of 14 Shahed 101s engaged. 5 neutralized. 1 oblique impact on vacant structure. 29 rocket impacts, 1 fuel fire contained. Runway partially degraded. Base operational. Personnel 11 injuries. 4 moderate, 7 minor. No fatalities. Conoco. 2 Fateh 110 intercepted by PAC-3 at maximum range. 1 terminal guidance malfunction. 6 impacted base area. Vehicle maintenance facility non-operational. Power temporarily severed. Personnel 0 injuries, 0 fatalities. Hardened positions effective. Base operational. Counter-operation 7 Reaper R-9X against Anbar. Launch vehicles JASSM-ER against remaining launch infrastructure GBU-39 against Salah ad-Din Shahed 101 structures JASSM-ER against Deir ez-Zor Fateh 110 positions. 26 of 29 target sets confirmed in first cycle. The IRGC had built a 14-month operational planning effort around a targeting database whose accuracy had been confirmed through 11 months of observation. The billeting complex coordinates were correct. The launch timing was correct. The salvo size calculation for CRAM saturation was technically sound. Every element had performed within the planned parameters. 72 hours of threat elevation response had emptied the buildings the Shahed 101s found. The CRAM had engaged at maximum rate and intercepted what it could. The PAC-3's 4-round allocation had required its outer boundary geometry to defeat 2 Fateh 110s at probability assessments that had been accepted as the best available option rather than a comfortable intercept confidence. The 11 injuries at Al-Asad were 11 personnel who had been in positions the duty officer had assessed as essential at the moment of the alert. The assessment had been wrong in 3 of 11 cases, in a way that the subsequent review would examine, but that the operational outcome did not change. 11 injuries, no fatalities, both bases operational. The 72 hours of alert posture had cost more in sustained personnel exhaustion and operational tempo disruption than the strike itself had cost in infrastructure. The base had cycled through 7 practice shelter drills in 72 hours, each consuming 30 minutes of personnel time from maintenance schedules, sleep cycles, and the routine operations that kept aircraft flyable and vehicles functional. The cumulative cost of that disruption was measurable in the maintenance backlog that existed at 3:31 a.m. compared to 72 hours earlier. The alert posture had cost something. The evacuation of the billeting complex had cost something in morale and sleep quality that the medical officer had been tracking in the daily readiness reports. None of that cost was negligible. All of it was acceptable when set against the 11 injuries the operation had produced rather than the 37 the post-strike analysis assessed would have resulted from a full-strength billeting complex occupancy. The 72 hours of alert posture had cost more in sustained personnel exhaustion and operational tempo disruption than the strike itself had cost in infrastructure. That was its own data point about the cost of persistent threat level elevation. Both kinds of cost were real. The balance between them was a command judgment that both the Al-Asad and Conoco commanders had been making continuously for 72 hours. They had made it correctly on the specific question of personnel shelter. On the specific question of essential vehicle operations at the moment of first impact, the duty officer had assessed wrong by a margin that produced 11 injuries rather than none. The operational review would examine that assessment. The operational timeline had already moved past it. Al-Asad had runway repair teams working at 3:45 a.m. Conoco had its generator running and its communications restored. The MQ-9 Reapers were back on overwatch above the Anbar province corridor. The intelligence collection that would provide the next threat elevation indicator was already running. The cycle continued.